Hi, I'm Crichton, and this is going to be a very positive review of Doom 2016. Before I begin, let me say a word or two about the FPS renaissance of the past few years that we've had the pleasure and the privilege of participating in. Note, by participating, I mean passively observing, and by privilege, I mean being there to observe passively. Whereas by pleasure, I mean the relative jolt of joy, not to mention consonance, that we feel upon changes in the gaming industry that for some reason convenience us a lot more than just about every other aspect of our lives. Which is in reality kind of sad, but then again, every conceivable pleasure is technically a form of escapism, including those which absence would try to ameliorate by means of virtual entertainment. For we do in fact live in a fallen, broken, hopeless, and indisputably sad and unjust world. But hey, look at all these video games, huh? And if you thought that sounded really smart, wait till you hear my analysis of the phenomenon. So the Renaissance that I speak of began in the first half of the second decade of the second millennium as we know it, namely 2013 AD. See, up until that point, going back all the way to around 2008, the first-person shooter scene was rather bland. It was preoccupied by a trend of that subgenre typically referred to as the modern military shooter, or the MMS, which was pioneered by the very successful Modern Warfare franchise and a multitude of other titles that tried to emulate it. Now, I don't actually think that modern military shooters are inherently bad or that we had no good first-person shooters throughout this period, but rather that so many titles were trying to mimic the COD formula that the whole FPS scene came to be largely associated with that particular subgenre. Moreover, titles that tried to deviate from that norm oftentimes deviated in the wrong direction, at least in regards to first-person shooters, as they sacrificed the FPS mechanics for elements that could be classified as either too assimilating, and that they came from other genres and created hybrids rather than shooters on the one hand, and on the other, elements that can be classified as lazy developers don't feel like engaging in level design. Now, some titles did try to get around this, and they tried to go back to their classical roots, much like the precursors of the actual Renaissance, and most of the time, if not all of the time, they failed. Some, like Duke Nukem Forever, were outright flops on their own accords. Others, like Hard Reset or Singularity, which is severely underrated by the way, had other factors impeding on their success. It was not until a successful batch of reboots of classical shooters hit the markets that the Renaissance finally took place. This started in 2013 with Shadow Warrior, continued through 2014 and 15 with Wolfenstein: The New Order and The Old Blood, and culminated with, I believe, Doom in 2016. At which point the classical shooter re-established itself as a valid iteration of the genre and one that modern audiences would find enjoyable enough to make profitable. So once more we have Doom redefining the genre, saving it in the process. Which is kind of the opposite of what its name suggests. Then again, we can't really have a game called Salvation. Alright, maybe one. So without further ado, let's go straight into the review, and because I am such a conventional meta person, I will begin with graphics. Do you like what you see on screen? Then you like the game's graphics, because that's kind of what you're looking at right now. What more could I say? They're great, and there's that. And I know there are people who accuse the game of occasional low-res textures and visual glitches or allegedly low poly count models, but that kind of critique only serves to point our relation to our simian cousins in the jungle. Look, the graphics of Doom are as good as they get. Minor flaws are to be expected. But if you take into account the game's incredible optimization, then you will come to realize that Doom is unparalleled in a ratio between aesthetics and performance. I mean, it is a beautiful game that runs smoother than nugget grease off a brony's neckbeard. I've said it in my Wolfenstein review, Doom is the very definition of optimization. Running it maxed out on a GTX 1060 and recording with Shadowplay, the framerate did not drop once. The only issue I had was one point of the game that seemed to crash when Shadowplay's instant replay was active. Other than that, there are no remarks I have about Doom from a technical point of view. Now what I could talk about, however, in regards to graphics, is the design. And to put it briefly, not only does it do what a loyal reboot ought to do, namely take the original concepts that add detail, but in a way, it also surpasses the original designs. And that it feels like this rendition of the Doom universe is closer to the actual Doom universe, were it real. Now, you know, in a Lovecraftian sense. Maps look like original Doom maps, plus visual upgrades and verticality. Weapon models are based on the originals, with the exception that this time around they're trying to be more congruent with a sci-fi only loadout, and the same applies to demons. Now there are some changes I disagree with, such as the pink guys looking a bit too armored, or the shotgun having been replaced with a generic high-tech model instead of the classical pump action, but most deviations from the original are generally for the better. For instance, possessed soldiers look more demonic, and the plasma rifle does not look like an accordion. So the implementation of modern technology to improve on the original design seems spot on. The devs seem to have perfectly understood the aim of the original Doom's visual effects. Horror plus gory violence multiplied by badassery. The environments vary from claustrophobic to agoraphobic, from dark, destroyed, dirty, and bloodstained to well-lit, intact, clean, and bloodstained. And the gore, though scripted, is diverse and very well done. Now, speaking of environments, take note of the definite horror vibe and how it is being countered by presentation and gameplay mechanics. how both major themes as well as minor details point to there being something much larger and more sinister than the player observes at present. But even so, it is unlikely for one to call it a scary game. The ambient may be bleak, but it is not depressing, and the scenery may be desolate, but it is far from empty. And that is precisely because of the main protagonist and the way he interacts with the world. Had it been anyone other than Doom Guy, or the minority of people who can beat giant demons to death with their own broken off horns, Doom 2016 would have been a horror title. And you know what? I think it would be neat if we got a spin-off title, be it an independent game or an expansion, or if not that, at least a mod, that focuses on another survivor of the invasion, with more of a horror survival vibe to the gameplay, similar to Doom 3, which, albeit not a good Doom title, was a good game nevertheless. But, back on topic. Let's talk a bit about how the game treats the story.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Samuel Hayden. I'm the head of this facility. I think we can work together and resolve this problem in a way that benefits us both.
That's right, it is the perfect type of storyline for a Doom game. Some would argue it is inexistent. I would argue that it is rather unobtrusive. There is in fact a story, and there is a decent database of lore that you can collect and spend several hours reading if you so please. Moreover, the premise itself is actually pretty intelligent for a video game, and it is being developed with a subtle and ironic wit.
I'm willing to take full responsibility for the horrible events of the last 24 hours, but you must understand. Our interest in their world was purely for the betterment of mankind. Everything has clearly gotten out of hand now, yes. But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
And it is more relevant to reality than one might initially think. It's there, it's good, but it doesn't take itself too seriously, all the while avoiding stepping into the land of the silly. But if you don't want to follow the story, you are by no means obliged to. In fact, you can ignore it completely, which can be a real blessing if you're doing a second playthrough. And now we're moving on to the core of the game, gameplay. The gameplay alternates between action-packed arena-style checkpoints that have you fighting off dozens of enemies at a time, and progress/exploration sequences mixed with occasional run-ins with smaller groups of enemies. Now, I call these sequences merely for the sake of pointing out the difference in pacing. In reality, the shift is mostly seamless. The progression is natural, and it is devoid of the artificial fight areas that seem to permeate a lot of similar titles. So much so that it can't really point out the ratio between big battles and downtime. What's more is that neither presents itself as the main focus or selling point of the game. It is rather the holistic experience comprised of both high-intensity combat interwoven with slower-paced sections that make Doom's gameplay so satisfying. Now for the big battles, the goal is to survive and kill every demon that's thrown your way. Not much is obvious. What's notable is that the skill set required is rooted in maneuverability and positioning just as much as it is in having good aim. And that is a big thing in classical shooters. You may be a crack shot, but unless you can dodge projectiles and keep track of enemy positions, you will be dead before you're 90 degrees through with your 360 no-scope. You will also have to get through each battle within the progressive borders of the checkpoint, as the game has no manual saves. The challenge demands performance over time as opposed to miniature bursts of skill during miniature bits of the actual battle. The checkpoint system thus posed, although a deviation from the norm, appears to be a deliberate mechanic designed to test the player's endurance and ability to cope with large enemy hordes, and in doing so it adds a lot more suspense during battles. Aiding you in this is the addition of a new mechanic which has you relying on glory kills and chainsaw kills in order to refill health and ammo. Glory kills let you execute weakened enemies and get health in return, making combat more tactical later on, as you find yourself trying to avoid needless killing of lesser enemies, treating them like some kind of unorthodox health pickups. Chainsaw kills, on the other hand, can one-hit kill anybody provided you have the fuel, and they drop ammunition instead, which is a very logical use for the weapon you specifically turn to when you're out of ammo. The rest of the combat is just as you'd expect it to be, more or less original Doom, but with mouse look and added verticality. And the same general description applies to the less hectic instances, which are about finding your way through the level. At times, you may have to engage in some platforming or puzzle solving, which works surprisingly well. In the meantime, you will no doubt want to do some exploration. Supplies and the occasional Easter egg aside, you will need to explore the levels in order to get upgrades, which in harder difficulty levels equates with survival. There is a rudimentary, though not underused upgrade system that allows you to upgrade your stats, suit, weapon attachments, and perks. The first two you find through exploration, while the other two require both exploration and performing some kind of a task. Whereas you could do without perks or suit upgrades, though I don't see why you want to ignore them, upgrading your stats and weapon attachments is crucial. Stats enable you to upgrade your health, armor, and ammo, and weapon attachments have to do with improving their alternate firing modes. Imagine playing through this section without a grenade launcher attachment, which is your only means for mid to long range damage early on. Now the upgrade system may sound out of place to some, but it is actually pretty simple and easy to use. In fact, the brilliant thing about it is that it is almost as intuitive as the core gameplay mechanics themselves. You just complete the challenge or the assigned task to get the point, and then you navigate to the appropriate menu. And unless you're the type of person who thinks Han Solo's death was well written, you should have no trouble understanding it. And if you've done it right, after the first few levels, you will begin noticing a difference in how you stand in reference to the demons. Once a glass cannon without much of a cannon turned bullet sponge with mini nukes who two-shots big guys. There is also a multiplayer feature which is suboptimal, albeit not horrible. The best I could call it is mediocre. You might put some hours into it, but don't expect too much. Although I do not feel credible to talk about it given that I'm not too big on multiplayer. Nor should you be in this case. Doom's primary appeal is the single player. For this purpose, the developers have granted us the Snap Map, which is a custom map editor. It has a definite appeal to it with some very good player-made maps and modes. However, at present it does not seem like it will achieve the success of the original Doom's modding community. Then again, that is likely to change. So the bulk of Doom 2016 comes down to the campaign. It is roughly 12 hours long in the first playthrough, and it can be easily doubled with a second playthrough which, believe it or not, will probably take you longer to complete than the first. This is because the second playthrough ought to be done in a higher difficulty setting. And let me tell you, switching from one difficulty to another turns Doom into a different game. Things you could initially get away with become too punishing to even contemplate, and enemies you used to underestimate become nightmares to deal with. I recommend having your first playthrough on maximum violence, which has a decent ratio between difficulty and playability, and then playing again on nightmare, where taking more than 2 hits becomes too costly a luxury, and the difficulty curve is so steep that you're guaranteed a solid challenge. This is also the hardest setting without going into the masochistic permadeath option one slot below. And then you might want to do yet a third run where you get to keep your weapons in your upgrades and just run and gun your way through the campaign without being challenged until late game. A kind of a new game plus, if you will. And maybe a fourth one for various reasons, including the hell of it. So you're looking at around 24 to 48 hours of gameplay in the single player alone. And no matter how you feel about the multiplayer and the custom maps, you'll probably invest some time in those as well. So it goes without saying that Doom 2016 is a great package and a great deal. Objectively. id Software have created a great-looking, perfectly optimized reboot of the Doom franchise, with mechanics as close to the classical layout as they get, most differing parts being straight-up improvements, an unobtrusive story, and a well-paced, well-balanced gameplay with quite the abundant playtime. In a flurry of blood, gore, hard rock, and mayhem, wielding guns that feel and behave like scaled-down cannons, Doom Guy makes a glorious return. Let's hope there will be more, perhaps one where the chainsaw has an alt-firing mode and the music track is written by Jim Steinman. And a story quest where you rescue BG Blazkowicz from a Matrix-induced nightmare where demons are trying to make the new Colossus canon. Let's hope. I'm Crichton, you have been watching my review of Doom 2016. I'll see you all next time, especially 3 of you, though not excluding the other 2. Peace out, and take care, everybody.